Ezekiel Abaddon was not forged in the Emperor's gene labs or raised in temples of honor. He was born in the veins of Chthoniya, a crumbling world hollowed out by its own people, where violence wasn't learned but inherited. The planet churned with gang wars, mining syndicates, and brutal turf battles that lasted generations. In this underworld of fire, steel, and desperation, children became killers before they could read, and only the most merciless survived. From these pits of ruin came the one who would one day be called the Despoiler. Abaddon's early life was soaked in blood and dominance. He was the son of a gang warlord, though that meant nothing on Chthoniya, where kinship was a liability and power had no patience for sentiment. During his trial of ascension, he earned his name not through ritual, but by slaying his own father in single combat. No hesitation, no mourning, just one more corpse in the shadows of a world that devoured the weak. This act, both transgressive and admired, saw Ezekiel cast out. Exile on Chthoniya was often a death sentence, but for Abaddon it was a beginning. He wandered the Warren-like catacombs, hunted and hunted again, until the Lunar Wolves found him. Recruitment into the 16th Legion wasn't a choice. It was survival's next stage. When the gene seed took root in his body, it didn't create a new man. It refined the killer who already existed. Among the Lunar Wolves, Ezekiel's rise was meteoric. Not because he was a warrior, the 16th Legion had no shortage of those, but because he was unrelenting, cunning, and utterly devoted to the cause. His victories were not simply won, they were orchestrated. His presence on the battlefield broke morale, not just of the enemy, but of those within his own ranks who dared to waver. Horus Lupercal noticed, the primarch of the Lunar Wolves, newly anointed Warmaster of the Great Crusade, handpicked Ezekiel for more than his brutality. He saw something rarer, clarity. Among warriors often driven by impulse or pride, Abaddon was a weapon that sharpened itself. He was inducted into the Mournival, Horus's inner circle of advisors. 4 voices to temper or embolden the Warmaster's judgment. Even among the Mournival, Abaddon stood apart. Where Garviel Loken offered conscience and Tarek Torgadon levity, Abaddon brought steel resolve. He was the fire Horus would lean on when diplomacy failed, or when the Emperor's will needed to be enforced with iron rather than words. Abaddon was not a sycophant. He questioned orders when they lacked purpose, but he followed them without delay. And when the time came to silence dissenters, his hands never trembled. The Mechanicum gifted him with a personalized suit of cataphracti pattern Terminator armor tailored to his enormous frame. It was not merely protection. It was a symbol. When Abaddon entered battle encased in that ancient warplate, leading the Justerin, it was the signal that the Lunar Wolves would not negotiate. His warriors were clad in obsidian black even before the Legion's eventual fall, and they followed him with the devotion of a death cult. As first captain, Abaddon did not simply issue orders, he embodied them. His presence among the ranks of the Lunar Wolves became legend. Entire civilizations fell without resistance once it was known the black-armored giant was in orbit. His axe, a roaring crescent of death, and his bolter, wielded as though it were an extension of his wrath, reaped the Emperor's enemies in uncounted scores. But Abaddon was more than just a destroyer. He understood logistics, strategy, morale. He studied his foes with a scholar's intensity and dismantled them with the precision of a surgeon. His genius was cold, exacting, and devoid of vanity. For all his acclaim, Abaddon held a silent unease with the Imperium, not with its goals, but its god. While others whispered of the Emperor's divinity, Abaddon remained unmoved. He had bled in the void and ash of unnumbered worlds for the man on the golden throne, but he saw no deity. He saw a ruler absent from the wars that defined his empire, a creator who left his sons to finish his work while he vanished into secrecy. This disillusionment was not yet rebellion, not yet, but it smoldered behind his amber eyes. When Horus began to speak of betrayal, of gods older and darker than the Emperor, it wasn't dogma that tempted Abaddon. It was conviction. The belief that Horus had the strength to finish what the Emperor had abandoned. But in these early days, long before the heresy, before the title of Despoiler, Ezekiel Abaddon was still something rare in the Imperium. A space marine whose loyalty was forged not from blind faith, but through the fires of hardship, pragmatism, and the unshakable belief in victory. He was the Imperium's perfect sword, sharp, unbending, and ready to be wielded. And like any weapon held too long in a gauntlet of lies, he would one day turn against the hand that raised him. Chthoniya did not birth heroes. It bred survivors. It sculpted killers. And in Abaddon, it gave the galaxy something worse, a visionary forged in blood, armored in ambition, and waiting for the moment to remake the stars in his own image. The galaxy would remember Chthoniya not for its ruins, but for the sun it sent into the stars. The first sun, the last hope of a broken brotherhood, and the beginning of an unending war. The dream of unity was already decaying by the time the Horus heresy began. Beneath the triumphant banners of the Great Crusade, there lay fractured loyalties, growing resentments, and unspoken ambitions. For Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain of the Lunar Wolves, the betrayal that would engulf the Imperium did not erupt in a single moment. It crept like rust through armor, corroding the foundations of faith. The Emperor, the golden figure they had bled for, had vanished into secrecy, consumed by his own occult projects on Terra. And into that silence, Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster, stepped forward, not just as a commander of legions, but as a voice of purpose where the Emperor had become a ghost. Abaddon never viewed the heresy as treason. That word belonged to weak men clinging to hierarchy. For him, and for many of the Justarine who followed his lead, the heresy was a reckoning. The Imperium had abandoned its finest warriors, shackled them to obedience while the bureaucracy thrived, and buried the truth under lies. Horus had shown them the truth, that the gods of the warp were real, that power did not belong to a distant, absent emperor, and that the galaxy could still be reforged under a new vision. One of strength, not stagnation. When Horus fell at Davin, wounded by a cursed blade in the vaults of the Serpent Temple, it was Abaddon who fought to save him, not with medicine or prayer, but with fury. As Horus lay dying, it was Abaddon and his mournful brothers who turned to the word-bearers for aid, allowing the twisted rituals of the Serpent Lodge to commence. The act would forever damn them. What rose from that dark healing was not the same Horus who had led them during the Crusade. He had glimpsed the true power of chaos and embraced it. But to Abaddon, this was not corruption. It was ascension. The Emperor had lied to them. Horus would no longer wear those lies like shackles. It was during the purge of Isstvan III that the first blood was spilled in earnest. Loyalist elements within the Sons of Horus and other legions were lured to the surface under the pretense of quelling a rebellion. Abaddon, in his obsidian warplate, oversaw the orbital bombardment that buried those warriors beneath nuclear fire. No hesitation, no mourning, only necessity. Yet a handful of loyalists survived. Among them was Garviel Loken, once Abaddon's comrade in the Mournival. The two clashed beneath the ashen skies of the ruined city. In that moment, the brotherhood they had shared shattered irreparably. Their duel was not just a contest of blades, it was a clash of ideals. Loken fought for a dying dream. Abaddon fought for the future. When their battle ended, Loken was left broken, buried beneath rubble. Abaddon did not look back. As the heresy ignited into a galaxy-spanning civil war, Abaddon's role intensified. Horus relied on him not only as a battlefield commander, but as the enforcer of loyalty within the Sons of Horus. When dissent flickered, Abaddon extinguished it. When rival captains hesitated, he reminded them, through example or execution, that hesitation was death. He led the Justarin in strikes that broke cities, vaporized strongholds, and shattered regiments. His tactical brilliance was as undeniable as his brutality, yet Abaddon was not blind to the changes within Horus. The Warmaster, once the most charismatic and strategic of the primarchs, grew increasingly erratic, his will clouded by the whispers of the warp. Abaddon remained outwardly loyal, but beneath the surface, a seed of doubt took root. Horus had opened the path to power, but as the heresy dragged on, the question became whether Horus still had the strength to walk it. By the time the traitor legions reached Terra, that question hung in the air like the scent of blood. The siege of the Imperial Palace was apocalyptic. Titans clashed across shattered cities. Orbital debris rained fire. The skies screamed with the death of thousands every hour. And Abaddon, clad in his cataphractii armor, led the charge against the Emperor's defenders. He fought at the forefront of the Saturnine wall breach, his talon carving a crimson path through the Imperial fists, the ground scorched with every blow. During those months of siege, Abaddon began to see the rot not just in the Imperium, but in Horus himself. The Warmaster, now a being infused with chaos, rarely left the bridge of the vengeful spirit. He brooded, consumed by visions, his mind no longer entirely his own. Abaddon, ever the pragmatist, began to understand what the gods had truly done to his beloved Primarch. He did not voice these thoughts. Not yet. But in his silence, a new resolve began to form. When the final assault came, when the Emperor breached the vengeful spirit and confronted Horus in person, Abaddon was not present. Some accounts suggest he was fighting elsewhere aboard the ship. Others claim he was deliberately kept away. Regardless, the moment that changed history occurred without him. Horus was slain, the Emperor was mortally wounded, and the traitor legions scattered in disarray. It was Abaddon who recovered what remained of Horus. He stood before the broken corpse of his gene father, not with tears, but with fury. Horus had failed, not because he rebelled, but because he had become a puppet to powers he could not control. The man who had once inspired Ezekiel to believe in something greater had died long before the Emperor's hand struck him down. From that wreckage, Abaddon took two things. The first was the talon of Horus, the Warmaster's lightning claw, still wet with sanguineous blood, still crackling with unnatural energy. It was not simply a weapon. It was a mantle. The second thing he took was a lesson. Never become a slave to the gods. Use them, but never kneel. As the traitor fleet fled Terra, hounded by Imperial vengeance, Abaddon assumed command in all but name. The Sons of Horus had no Primarch, the galaxy had no mercy, and chaos, for all its gifts, demanded tribute in blood. But Ezekiel Abaddon was no longer the Emperor's sword. He was no longer even Horus's shadow. The heresy had burned those identities away. What remained was something colder, sharper, more dangerous. A survivor of Chthoniya, a killer of brothers, a general without a master. The Imperium saw the heresy as a tragedy. Abaddon saw it as a proving ground. The old gods had played their game. Now it was his turn. The heresy was over, but the war was not. Abaddon had survived the cataclysm at Terra, bearing the talon of Horus and the memory of a dream unfulfilled. The traitor legions, bloodied and leaderless, scattered like wounded predators. The Emperor sat broken upon the golden throne, and Horus, the fallen son who dared to challenge him, was dead. But Abaddon, he endured, not with sorrow or penance, but with purpose. Retreating into the Eye of Terror, the warp-shrouded wound in real space that pulsed like a bleeding scar, the traitor forces vanished into madness. The Imperium, shattered but not slain, proclaimed victory. For the Loyalists, it was an age of reconstruction. For the traitors, it was the beginning of damnation. And for Abaddon, it was the start of something far more dangerous than rebellion. It was the forging of resolve. The Eye was no sanctuary, it was a crucible. The warp bled into every rock, every breath. Time unraveled and thought warped under its pressure. Planets twisted with the whims of demons. Fortresses rose and fell in moments. Here, reality was a suggestion, and survival required more than strength. It demanded absolute will. Within this madness, the sons of Horus fared no better than the rest. Shattered by their failure at Terra and haunted by the death of their gene father, they fractured. Without Horus to rally behind, and with no clear successor to command, the Legion devolved into bickering war bands. Some clung to the past, whispering of Horus's glory. Others turned fully to the gods, surrendering to the madness of their new patrons. Infighting exploded like wildfire. Abaddon watched. He did not speak. He did not intervene. Not yet. He traveled alone or with a small band of hand-picked Justerin who had remained loyal to him rather than the broken corpse of their primarch. Across demon worlds and warp-blasted moons, he wandered, witnessing firsthand how swiftly the traitor legions had descended into savagery. He saw Emperor's children transformed into howling avatars of excess, their quest for sensation becoming an endless spiral of butchery. He saw the World Eaters lose even the last shreds of reason, their skull-strewn paths ruled only by Khorne's thirst. He saw Death Guard decay in living plague ships, bloated with Nurgle's rot. And he saw the Thousand Suns vanish into occult storms of sorcery and dust. There was no unity, no purpose, no empire, only ruin. Worse still, even his own legion, the once mighty sons of Horus, had begun to rot from within. With Horus gone, his legacy became a crutch. Warriors who had once stormed imperial palaces now groveled in temples built to a dead man. They renamed themselves the Luperci, swearing fealty not to chaos or the Long War, but to a corpse on a plinth. Idolatry rotted what little pride remained. The green and gray of the sons of Horus had become a banner of shame, drenched in failure. Some, like the heretic Fabius Bile, sought to resurrect the past literally. In hidden laboratories stitched together from salvage and blasphemy, Bile grew a clone of Horus. A new Warmaster, a new Messiah. Word spread and hundreds of broken legionaries flocked to him, desperate for salvation, eager to bow once more before a god that looked like victory. Abaddon did not. He came instead with fire and war. At the fortress of Melium, where the clone of Horus stood atop a makeshift throne, Abaddon arrived with his Justerin. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. No negotiations, no theatrics. In the heart of the fortress, he confronted the clone, this pitiful echo of a legend, and cut it down without a word. The talon of Horus screamed as it tore through its former master's flesh. When it was over, Abaddon burned the corpse, not just to kill it, but to erase it. The past was a chain he would no longer wear. Then he turned to those who had bowed to the false Horus and gave them a choice. Serve him, or join the ashes. Most knelt, some resisted, all who resisted died. And with that, Abaddon made his first proclamation. The sons of Horus were dead. There would be no more mourning, no more devotion to a memory soaked in failure. He ordered their armor blackened, not for sorrow, but for defiance. In the new darkness of the Eye of Terror, a new legion would rise. A legion that owed allegiance not to a primarch, not to a god, but to the war itself. The Black Legion was born. This renaming was more than symbolic. It was liberation. By discarding the weight of Horus's name, Abaddon shed the failures of the past. He would not be another echo of the heresy. He would be something else, something greater. The Long War was no longer about revenge. It was about conquest. Not a return to glory, but a reshaping of the galaxy. But unity was not easily won. The Eye of Terror was filled with rival warlords, petty tyrants who saw themselves as inheritors of Horus's mantle. One by one, Abaddon sought them out. He did not beg their loyalty. He took it. On the demon world of Garaxis, he challenged the champion Lord Garion in single combat and tore out his heart with the Talon. His warband joined the Black Legion within hours. On the demon moons of the Screaming Vortex, he cast the warpsmith Drakarth into a pit of sentient flame and emerged with control of his warp-augmented fleets. Where others bargained with demons, Abaddon commanded them. His authority came not from servitude, but from victory. The gods of chaos watched him with curiosity. Here was a man who used their power but refused their leash. He performed no grand rituals. He built no temples. Yet his name was spoken in whispers by prophets and madmen alike, and still he did not call himself Warmaster. Not yet. That title had been poisoned. Horus had worn it and failed. Abaddon would not take the same path. He would earn it on his own terms. In time, his legion grew, not just with former sons of Horus, but with warriors from all 9 traitor legions. Disillusioned night lords, wandering word-bearers, exiled iron warriors, all found a place in the Black Legion. Not because of loyalty to Abaddon, but because he offered something none of their own leaders could: a future, a cause. Within a few decades, Abaddon had become what the eye had not seen in millennia, a unifying force. He spoke not of penance or salvation, but of vengeance, dominance, and victory. His warriors fought not for gods or guilt, but for conquest. From the heart of the eye, he began to build his war machine, a fleet unlike any before, armies that no longer knelt to the memory of the past, but marched toward a singular goal: the death of the Imperium. Abaddon did not forget terror. He remembered every hallway of the Imperial Palace, every flame-lit trench, every brother slain beneath the golden banners. But he did not seek to avenge Horus. He sought to eclipse him. And as the Black Legion assembled, as the Eye of Terror pulsed with the rhythm of war, Abaddon stood at the prow of his command ship, the vengeful spirit, reborn and reforged. Around him stretched legions clad in shadow. Before him lay the stars. He did not smile. He simply pointed, and the long war began. The warbands had been tamed, the name of Horus buried. But Ezekiel Abaddon's ambition had only begun to take shape. From the depths of the Eye of Terror, in the heart of the madness where demons carved empires of flesh and time moved like broken glass, the first captain had completed the first great act of his long design, annihilating the past. What rose from that smoldering ruin was not a mere replacement for the sons of Horus. It was something more dangerous, more disciplined, more resolved. A legion not built upon inheritance but upon choice. The Black Legion had no god but war, and no future but conquest. They were born in fire and silence, not with fanfare but with iron will. Their armor, once sea green, now bore the void's reflection, absolute black rimmed in gold, a rejection of weakness, a statement of purpose. Each warrior who painted his ceramite did so as a vow, not of loyalty to Abaddon, but of commitment to the war itself. Chaos undivided, not as a religion but as a weapon. The Black Legion would not be dragged into the petty rivalries that shattered the other legions. No squabbling over whose god reigned supreme. The long war required focus, and Abaddon provided it. But to rally the traitor legions and bend them toward a single aim was no small feat. The heresy had left deep scars, not just in the flesh of the galaxy, but in the minds of those who fought it. For centuries, Chaos Space Marines had warred not just against the Imperium, but against one another. Broken by bitterness, seduced by demon lords, or lost to madness, these remnants had become warlords of nothing, kings of crumbling planets and dying fleets. Abaddon had no interest in titles without substance. He did not call himself Warmaster. Not yet. That word still stank of Horus's failure. Instead, he let his actions speak louder than empty proclamations. His first target was Gathus 9, a demon-infested forge world twisted by centuries of unchecked corruption. Its forges still burned, pumping out ancient weaponry fueled by flesh sacrifices. It was ruled by a self-proclaimed demon prince of iron, Dravaln the Boundless, a former iron warrior who had offered his soul to the warp and received bloated immortality in return. Dravaln had thousands of slaves, gun batteries that could incinerate starships, and warp-fused artillery that chanted as they fired. But he lacked vision. He saw the eye as a playground. Abaddon saw it as a staging ground. The assault on Gathus 9 was swift and merciless. The Black Legion struck like a scalpel, not a hammer. Boarding actions crippled orbital defenses before they could react. Ground forces, drilled in formation and war discipline, cut through corrupted militias like fire through parchment. Abaddon led the final charge into Dravaln's throne forge himself. The duel that followed was not poetic. There was no mutual respect, no kinship of Legion lineage, just precision and dominance. The talon of Horus severed the demon prince's arms at the elbow before Drachnien devoured his essence entirely. When it ended, Abaddon stood alone, surrounded by dying machines and burning shrines. Gathus 9 belonged to the Black Legion. That victory was not just territorial, it was symbolic. Word spread carried on demonic whispers and traitor voxnets. Abaddon was not simply another warlord, he was a force of unity. Chaos Space Marines from shattered warbands began to take notice. Some resisted, many joined, others fled, fearing what he would become. Next came the Scourge Stars, a triad of hell worlds infested with plague cults and Nurglite demons. The Lords of Decay, a Death Guard splinter group, had turned the system into a festering fortress. Where Dravaln had ruled through technological tyranny, the Lords of Decay wielded filth, rot, and entropy. They believed stagnation to be a form of purity. Their worlds did not bleed, they oozed. To attack such places was to step willingly into contagion. To survive was to become more than human. Abaddon sent 3 fleets. The first 2 were sacrificial. Their mission was not to win, but to gather intelligence and force the Death Guard to reveal their rituals. The third fleet carried the strike force. Each warrior within it had trained in sealed armor, lived among toxin-laced atmospheres, and studied the contagions they would face. Abaddon did not throw bodies at problems. He engineered victories. The fighting on the plague moons was brutal. Clouds of necrotic gas choked the air. Corpses rose to fight again, but the Black Legion endured, adapting with grim efficiency. Abaddon himself led the final assault on Mortrex, the largest of the infected moons. Demon engines and plague towers collapsed beneath targeted orbital strikes. In a final act of contempt, Abaddon detonated the Spire Temple at the moon's core, rupturing a warp nexus that had fed the Lords of Decay for centuries. From that ruin, Abaddon took more than territory. He claimed loyalty, or more accurately, obedience, not through charisma, through consequence. Those who bent the knee were given purpose. Those who refused were annihilated. The message was simple: follow or fall. His power grew. So did his vision. The Black Legion was no longer merely an army. It was a banner for all those who sought something beyond chaos's endless circles of backstabbing and mindless devotion. And into this growing structure came the lost, the ambitious, the broken. Night lords, exiles craving direction, iron warriors who despised Perturabo's isolation, even word-bearers tired of endless sermons and seeking practical war. The Black Legion absorbed them all, not as equals, but as assets. Still, Abaddon did not raise the title Warmaster. He waited, tested. Not until his legion had achieved something would he claim the mantle. That moment came in the aftermath of his greatest internal challenge. A warband known as the Sons of the Eye, led by a sorcerer lord named Zaradeth, declared that Abaddon was a fraud. They claimed Horus's bloodline could not be succeeded, that the mantle of the 16th Legion should remain vacant until a true scion emerged. Zaradeth had amassed hundreds of followers, many of them former Justician who still clung to the name of Horus. They fortified a demon moon called Irkalla, whose surface was a labyrinth of sorcerous illusions and psychic traps. Abaddon launched no fleet, no grand assault. Instead, he went alone. He walked through the illusions, cutting down summoned horrors without breaking stride. Zaradeth attempted to banish him with spells woven from the warp itself. Drachnyen consumed them. When Abaddon reached the heart of Irkalla, he found the sorcerer chanting before a massive effigy of Horus, carved in obsidian and draped in sacrificial entrails. Abaddon said nothing. The talon of Horus punched through Zaradeth's breastplate. His heart was still beating when it was torn out. Abaddon turned to the gathered traitors. "This," he said, holding the bloodied organ, "is your legacy." Then he crushed it. The Sons of the Eye fell silent, and one by one they knelt. Only then did Abaddon take the title. Warmaster of Chaos. Not as Horus's heir, but as the weapon that Horus never became. A creature of strategy, fury, and calculated will. The gods did not crown him. He crowned himself. The Black Legion, now unified under a singular purpose, no longer lurked in the eye. They prepared, forged weapons, built fleets, struck out into real space on raids not for plunder, but for testing Imperial defenses. Every campaign was a question asked of the Imperium, every retreat a lesson, every victory a step closer to the true war to come. The Long War had entered a new era, and the galaxy would come to learn that while Horus had been the architect of a single rebellion, Abaddon was the prophet of unending war. It began not with a declaration, but with a silence broken. A silence that had lasted centuries, a pause between the heresy's fall and the resurgence of something darker, something colder. Abaddon the Despoiler, now self-proclaimed Warmaster of Chaos, no longer needed to convince anyone. The Eye of Terror whispered his name, and real space shuddered under the echo. The Imperium, bloated and self-assured after driving the traitor legions into exile, believed its wounds had healed. It had forgotten how to fear. Abaddon came to remind it. The year was 781 M31, 500 years after the fall of Horus. From the swirling madness of the Eye, black-armored warships slipped into real space. They bore no heraldry, no house sigils, only the icon of the eightfold star wrapped in a snarling wolf's skull, neither a tribute nor a promise, but a warning. The First Black Crusade had begun. At the heart of this storm, leading the assault aboard the vengeful spirit, was Abaddon himself. The same vessel that once ferried Horus to Terra had been reclaimed, its decks sanctified with the blood of loyalist prisoners, its machine spirits shattered and reforged through ritual. The ship moved like a blade across the void, a shadow made manifest. His target was not random. He struck where the Imperium least expected it, and yet should have known better. The Cadian Gate, the last real bulwark against the Eye of Terror. Cadia and its surrounding systems formed a strategic corridor, a fortress wall that separated the seething warp from the soft underbelly of the Imperium. Should that gate fall, there would be nothing to stop the tide. Abaddon did not come to seize it. Not yet. He came to test it, to bleed it, to announce that the long war had begun. The Cadian defense fleets scrambled into action. The Imperial Guard mobilized. Astra Militarum officers awoke to Vox signals bristling with static and terror. Black ships emerged without warning, warp storms snapping at their heels. Planets burned. Astropaths screamed and were found with their eyes melted to their skulls. The first salvos of the Black Legion were not barrages, they were messages. But amidst this chaos, Abaddon's true purpose remained hidden. He was not waging war for territory or vengeance. He was hunting something. Within the warp-riddled border worlds near Cadia, deep beneath the blasted crust of a long-dead world named Uralan, ancient rumors spoke of a sealed vault. The few who remembered it described it as a prison, not for a creature but for an idea, a shard of something that should not exist. The Tower of Silence, they called it, a monolith of forgotten purpose. It was here, Abaddon believed, that he would find a blade worthy of the war to come. While the Black Legion struck at Imperial positions across the sector, sowing confusion and forcing the defenders to overextend, Abaddon led a smaller, more precise force into the abyssal depths of Uralan. The mission was cloaked in secrecy. Only his most trusted warriors accompanied him, ancient Justerin, warp-bound sorcerers, and a handful of warpsmiths. What they found beneath the surface was not a vault. It was a wound. The Tower of Silence was not built of stone or metal, but of obsidian thought, a structure carved from the boundary between the material universe and the immaterium. It pulsed, it breathed, it hungered. Statues lined the halls, faceless and eyeless, etched with runes that shimmered only when not directly looked upon. And at its heart was a black mirror that did not reflect the viewer, but remembered them. Abaddon stepped forward. The others dared not follow. In that mirror he saw himself, not as he was, but as he could become. The destroyer of empires, the bringer of endings, the one who would break the galaxy's spine. And in his reflection's hand was a weapon. No simple sword, a sliver of the warp given shape, a thing that had no beginning and no proper name, only a hunger. The entity that slumbered within sensed him. It stirred. Most men would have recoiled. Even the most devout demonologists knew to fear such artifacts. But Abaddon reached forward, unflinching. His gauntlet closed around the hilt. The air cracked. Reality tore, and Drachnaian was born again. The blade screamed. Not aloud, but inside. It howled through the memories of every warrior present, scraping across their minds like rusted chains. Even those who had fought at Istvan and Terra fell to their knees, blood leaking from their ears. Abaddon remained standing. The demon's sword writhed in his grip, a weapon and a will. Its edge shimmered, phasing in and out of material space. It was said to be the first murder given form, the original sin of the warp, bound to steel. It did not speak, for it had no voice. It devoured. Souls, thoughts, flesh, time. Where it struck, nothing remained but absence. With the blade in hand, Abaddon turned from the mirror. The reflection was gone. There was no longer any need for what could be. He was. When he emerged from Uralan, the battle across the sector had reached a fever pitch. The Imperial Navy had regrouped, pushing the Black Legion back from the heart of Cadia. The defenders believed they were winning, but Abaddon had never sought to conquer. He had come for a weapon. He had it now. Withdrawing his forces, he gave the order to begin the first true Black Crusade withdrawal. Unlike the traitor retreats after Terra, this was no rout. It was measured, tactical. The vengeful spirit escaped through a corridor of warp storms, deliberately seeded by his sorcerers. Dozens of smaller vessels sacrificed themselves to cover the retreat, detonating warp cores and triggering phasic breaches that swallowed pursuing Imperial ships whole. When the Cadian fleet finally secured the system, they found no trace of Abaddon, only wreckage and words carved into the surface of the outermost moon in letters 5 kilometers tall. The Long War begins. The Imperium had weathered the attack, but beneath that fragile surface, something had shifted. The defenders could not deny it. This was no isolated warband raid, no random cult uprising. This was coordinated, focused, purposeful. Abaddon had announced his return, and he had done it not with a conquest, but with a message. Chaos was no longer content to exist in exile. The Great Eye had opened, the Warmaster had arisen, and he wielded a sword that could unmake reality. In the Eye of Terror, the Black Legion celebrated, not as madmen, but as soldiers vindicated. The First Crusade had not been about victory. It had been about transformation, a crucible, and Abaddon had passed through it wielding Drachenyen, the blade of endings. The demon sword did not sleep. In battle, it wailed like a chorus of the damned. It sang to the warp. It peeled open the skin of existence. And Abaddon wielded it with the calm of one who knew it was merely a tool, not his master. This was the difference between Abaddon and Horus. Horus had fallen under the weight of Chaos's gifts. He had believed himself chosen. Abaddon knew better. The gods were not benefactors. They were weapons, like the Talon of Horus, like Drachenyen, and he would use them or discard them as the war demanded. With his legion reforged, his enemies warned, and his weapon claimed, Abaddon returned to the Eye of Terror. The Imperium had withstood his first strike. It would not survive the next. The Long War had truly begun. He did not seek the sword out of vanity. Abaddon the Despoiler had never been a creature of ornament or indulgence. His armor bore no needless decoration. His banners were stained with only the marks of war. But even he knew the truth whispered in the shadows of the eye. The wars to come would not be won with steel and courage alone. To break an empire such as the Imperium, he would need a weapon not of this reality, but of the one beneath it. And so he came to Uralan. Uralan was not a planet, not truly. It was a wound in the galaxy's skin, hidden in the outer edges of the Cadian Gate. There, wrapped in warp storms and silence, stood the Tower of Silence, a structure without origin, untouched even by the long shadow of the old night. It did not appear on any Imperial chart. No starships recorded it. Yet for those who heard its call, it was as loud as thunder. Abaddon was not lured. He chose to come. Long before the First Black Crusade was launched, before he had begun to test the strength of the Imperium's defenses, he had already begun the search. The whispers reached him through the mouths of broken psychers, through ancient demon priests who spoke in flayed tongues. They all spoke of a blade that had no name until it was given one by its wielder. A shard of the Imperium made manifest, not a tool of war, but a truth buried in the skin of the universe. The sword had waited through millennia of silence. It waited still. Abaddon walked into the tower alone. No honor guard, no sorcerer to hold back the warp's malice. Just the Warmaster, clad in Terminator plate, bearing the Talon of Horus on his gauntlet. It pulsed with remembered blood, but he did not raise it. It was not the weapon he needed. Inside, time faltered. The tower was not built. It was grown. Its walls bled light. Its geometry shifted when stared at directly. Columns bent in impossible angles, and gravity obeyed a logic older than physics. Voices whispered in languages long extinct, not in Abaddon's ears, but in his memories. Some called him by name, others called him Horus. One voice, cold and patient, said only, "He has come." He descended for what might have been hours or days. Time had no meaning here. He passed murals of black oceans and dead stars. He saw reflections of himself in mirrors that hadn't been polished in 10,000 years. In one, he was seated on the golden throne. In another, he was flayed and nailed to the hull of a ship. But he did not flinch. These were not visions. They were lies. He had faced lies before. He had killed them. At the base of the tower, in a chamber that existed outside the concept of space, he found it. Suspended in a mirror of absolute darkness, it hung, neither forged nor born, but waiting. It had no form until it was chosen, and as Abaddon stepped closer, it reached into him. Not physically, not even psychically. It knew him. It saw the boy from Chthoniya who had killed his own father in a trial of blood. It saw the first captain standing at Horus's side during the Great Crusade. It saw the brother who had betrayed the Emperor and the son who had watched his gene father fall. But more than that, it saw the hatred, the refusal, the unbreakable will of a man who had never once surrendered, not to fear, not to fate, not even to the gods he served. And it responded. The mirror cracked. 1,000 shards rained upward, defying gravity. In Abaddon's right hand, a hilt coalesced, formed not of metal, but of intent. From it flowed Drachnyen, the end of empires. It screamed as it was born, not in sound, but in meaning. It was hunger and memory. It was the first act of murder echoed through time. It was a thing that had no creator, because its existence was inevitable. Abaddon gripped it and did not recoil. The blade writhed in his grasp, its edge shivering with unreal heat, its form shifting, at times a long sword, at times a cleaver, sometimes a staff of light. He imposed shape upon it. His will forced it into stability, and it obeyed. Not because it was tamed, but because it respected him. Where others would become slaves to its hungers, Abaddon stood above it. He did not offer it blood. He offered it war. Drachnyen responded not like a demon appeased, but like a weapon finally given purpose. When Abaddon returned to the Black Legion's fleet, he did not speak of what transpired. He did not hold the blade aloft or proclaim himself chosen. Instead, he boarded the vengeful spirit, walked to the war room, and drove the sword into the table of campaign stars. The table split. The stars flickered. Vox screens bled static. Warp wards triggered alarms. Abaddon said nothing. From that moment, Drachnyen was never far from his side. He did not wear it as a trophy. It was not a symbol. It was an extension of his judgment, drawn only when the moment demanded devastation. And yet, the blade was not without cost. In the years that followed, those who fought beside him noticed changes, not corruption, not madness, but something colder, more final. Abaddon no longer indulged in speeches. He no longer tolerated failure. He wielded Drachnyen with terrifying efficiency, carving through battle lines, terminators, dreadnoughts, even demon princes. Not with rage, but with authority. When he struck, the blade screamed, and what it struck disappeared. It did not kill, it consumed. Its victims left no corpses, no remains, only impressions in the warp, echoes of agony twisted into soundless screams. And yet, Abaddon never let the blade dominate him. In private, it is said, he spoke to the sword, not as a servant, but as a rival, a voice in the dark to which he made no oaths. In return, Drachnyen gave him something no other champion of chaos possessed: clarity. Where others were lost to madness or obsession, Abaddon moved with singular purpose. Some among his inner circle feared it. Others worshipped it. One warlord, foolish enough to claim it was the blade and not the hand that ruled, was executed on the spot. His soul was fed to the sword in silence. The gods watched all this with amusement. Khorne saw only blood. Tzeentch saw a man playing their game too well. Nurgle respected the endurance and Slaanesh admired the blade's artistry, but none of them could control him. And that, perhaps, was the greatest threat. Abaddon did not become a demon prince. He refused, rejected, denied every offer of immortality. Drachnien hissed with disdain when such temptations came, but Abaddon never wavered. To him, becoming a demon was not elevation. It was submission. He would remain mortal, because only a mortal can hate. Only a mortal can choose to defy fate, and only a mortal can look into the eye of a god and say, "You serve me." Drachnien knew that. That is why it stayed. That is why, when the blade struck, the galaxy remembered. In the centuries that followed, the name of Drachnien became legend. But it was not the sword that frightened inquisitors and chapter masters. It was the man who wielded it without reverence. A blade can be dangerous, but a blade that thinks, and a man who refuses to be bent by it, that is apocalypse. And as Abaddon carved the future into the galaxy one stroke at a time, it became clear. Drachnien was not his destiny. It was his instrument, and the song it sang was the death of empires. Abaddon did not rise because he was loved. He rose because he was feared, and more crucially, because he was understood. Not as a zealot or a prophet, but as a warlord who made no illusions about what he was, the weapon that would unmake the galaxy. Unlike Horus, who rallied legions through charisma and the promise of liberation, Abaddon offered nothing but the long war, an endless campaign of attrition, terror, and annihilation. There were no speeches at the start of his Black Crusades, no stirring declarations of vengeance. When Abaddon gathered his forces, he did so not with firebrand sermons or divine proclamations, but with truth. His message was simple. The Imperium was rotting, the Emperor was absent, and those who followed him were either fools or slaves. Those who followed Abaddon would not be saved. They would not be rewarded. They would become the storm that swallowed stars. This wasn't strategy. It was psychology. Abaddon understood the minds of warriors because he had never forgotten what it meant to bleed. He knew what drove men: hatred, ambition, the need to be remembered. And he fed those needs not by promising paradise, but by offering them a place at the front of history's funeral pyre. He was not the loudest voice in a war council. He was the one others quieted for. His presence alone altered the atmosphere of a chamber. Veterans would instinctively check their weapons. Psychers would lower their eyes. Even demon princes who had ruled for millennia treated him with a wary respect. He did not demand loyalty through sorcery or threat. He commanded it through sheer force of personality. But what made Abaddon so dangerous was not his power. It was his restraint. Where others raged, he planned. Where warbands fought among themselves, he unified them through targeted, clinical purges. When rival Chaos Lords grew too bold, they were not shouted down. They were eliminated, quietly, efficiently, a poisoned drink, a collapsed corridor, a whispered accusation that led to a dozen knives in the dark. Abaddon had learned from Horus's greatest failure, trust. Where Horus had embraced his brothers as equals, Abaddon tolerated no peers. There was only his will. That is why the Black Legion did not fracture like the Word-Bearers or the Night Lords. It bent because Abaddon gave it no other choice. He accepted difference, indeed he welcomed it, but only if it served his vision. He permitted sorcerers to consort with demons, Khorne, berserkers, to rage in his name, and technophiles of the Dark Mechanicum to tinker with Xenos weaponry. But the moment their practices threatened unity, they were burned away. not because Abaddon feared their power, but because he understood it too well. He believed that war was not won by extremes, but by control. Cold, merciless control. The vengeful spirit, his flagship and fortress, was a microcosm of this philosophy. A cathedral of war, yet devoid of chaos's anarchic entropy. Its corridors ran on strict discipline. Its command decks echoed with order, not madness. Marines who disobeyed were flayed. Those who broke the chain of command were incinerated in plasma furnaces. The crew of the vengeful spirit did not serve a warband. They served a regime. Abaddon also understood the value of legacy. Every major act of war was calculated to strike not merely at military targets, but at meaning. The loss of life meant little to him unless it disrupted symbols, statues, saints, traditions, beliefs. He would annihilate a world's grain supply not to starve it, but to make its people fear starvation. He destroyed temples not to offend the faithful, but to unravel their certainty. He treated the Imperium like a body and chose to wound its pressure points. Cut a nerve here, sever a tendon there, let it stagger before you strike the heart. There was no mercy in this. Not even hatred, really. Abaddon no longer felt the burning anger that had once consumed him after Horus's death. He had outgrown it. In its place was something colder. Clarity. He saw the Imperium not as a foe, but as a disease, a lie sustained by inertia. He would be the scalpel that sliced it open. Slowly, precisely. And yet, Abaddon was not without fury. He kept it buried beneath his armor, beneath the layers of discipline and strategy. But it emerged in battle. When he stepped onto a war-torn field, he became something else entirely. He did not charge mindlessly. He advanced like a tide, implacable, inescapable. Dranian in one hand, the talon of Horus in the other, he tore through formations with the ease of a god and the silence of a grave. No wasted movement, no hesitation, every blow a verdict. He did not shout as he killed. He watched, locked eyes with those he slew. Let them see that the one ending their lives was not a demon, not a monster, but a man. That was always the final cruelty. Abaddon was no longer inhuman. He was all too human, and yet utterly beyond reach. Those who survived his assaults often described it not as a battle, but as a punishment. A reckoning that came not from a creature of madness, but from a mind that had decided their world no longer deserved to exist. Even in his rare defeats, Abaddon was never beaten. He simply withdrew, studied, and adapted. The Gothic War, a lesson. The sieges of Tarsus, a test. Every setback was a stone laid in the path toward the 13th Crusade. His war was not one of territory or thrones. It was of correction. And in his mind, the galaxy had erred. He was the correction. The Black Legion mirrored his mindset. No longer merely the remnants of the Lunawolves, they had become a vast engine of psychological warfare. Not chaos embodied, but chaos disciplined. Their heraldry was black not just for mourning, but for absorption. They consumed other warbands, assimilated other legions, and made their strength his. This too was psychological, a reminder that resistance was not noble. It was futile. What makes Abaddon terrifying is not just that he's a brilliant tactician or an unstoppable warrior. It's that he's inevitable. He doesn't need to win every battle. He only needs to outlast you. And in a galaxy where empires fall and names are forgotten, his remains. Because unlike Horus, who wanted to replace the Emperor, Abaddon has no interest in thrones. He wants to bring the throne room down. He doesn't dream of being worshipped. He dreams of ending the lie of the Emperor's divinity, of unmaking the machinery of blind obedience and hollow victory. His dream is not glory. It's liberation through devastation. In his own words, spoken once and never repeated, there is no peace to come. There is only the truth, and the truth is war. And that is why Abaddon, the Despoiler, the Warmaster of Chaos, wages his unending crusade. Not for gods, not for vengeance, but because he must. Because the galaxy cannot end until he ends it, not with mercy, but with meaning. Baeli's corona was not chosen because it was weak. Abaddon chose it because it was trusted. In the sprawling war machine of the Imperium, trust is a force multiplier. Admirals sleep easier knowing their refit yards will turn fleets around on schedule. Generals commit forces into deep campaigns believing their supply lines are stable. Baeli's corona was the anchor that made those assumptions possible across whole swathes of the segmentum obscurus. So Abaddon set out not to conquer it, but to corrupt the assumption that it would always work. What he did to Baeli's corona would echo across centuries, long after his ships were gone. That was the point. He began with information, not orbital fire. The Black Legion had spent decades capturing, trading, and extorting Mechanicus data caskets, navigator cartographs, and Imperial Navy yard rotation schedules, taken from convoy raids no Imperial log ever linked together. Those fragments mattered little separately. Combined, they described the rhythm of Baeli's Corona's industry. When its foundries spooled to maximum output, when its hull-plating deliveries peaked, when pilgrimage traffic overloaded its customs filters, when senior engine seers rotated off-station for devotion cycles. In those windows of strain, systems ran hot. Safeguards were bypassed for efficiency. Hierarchy thinned. That was where infection would take root. Abaddon convened a closed council aboard the Vengeful Spirit. No grand war conclave, just a handful he trusted to understand scale. Zarafiston, the Warp Seer, Thurkarax, a former Dark Mechanicum fabricator with an eidetic memory for machine code liturgies, and 3 mortal logisticians stolen from different Imperial fleet commands and broken to obedience. Before the hololithic star chart flared to life, Abaddon set a single rule. We do not break Baeli's corona. We teach it to break itself. The operation unfolded in 3 converging strands: occult contamination, data corruption, and credibility fracture. Occult contamination was seeded years in advance. Cult networks Abaddon had quietly fostered in second-tier labor platforms began purity rites that were anything but. Symbol arrays etched under plating, prayer chains reversed in sequence, oils mixed with trace warp reactive compounds. None explosive, all subtly contaminant. The rites bled into maintenance cycles. Junior tech adepts copied them without understanding origin, believing them sanctioned variants from remote doctrinal revisions. Each micro-blasphemy nudged machine spirits toward agitation. Reactors required more appeasement. Error rates climbed in background logs where no one looked unless a system failed catastrophically. Data corruption leveraged arrogance. Baeli's corona maintained redundancy across cogitator stacks spread through habitat rings, orbital anchorages, and planetary archives. Redundancy means mirrors. Mirrors mean trust in the copy. Thurkarax wrote mimic liturgies capable of inserting ghost subroutines into the reconciliation layer between archive nodes, self-correcting code that only activated when full system resync occurred during high-load states. Translation: the system sabotaged itself when, under pressure. Damage manifested as miscalculated warp translation vectors, mistime-stamped maintenance certifications, and, most devastating, fabrication tolerance drift in plasma chamber shields so slight it passed inspection yet shortened field performance lifespans by orders of magnitude once those vessels entered prolonged campaigns. Ships built to spec began suffering cascading failures months or years later, far from Baeli's corona, in wars that assumed their fleets were sound. Credibility fracture targeted people. Abaddon understood that institutions fail fastest when leaders stop trusting reports. Through intercepted astropathic relays and demonic echo casting, forged communiques, each containing truths salted with poison, were drip-fed into the system. A dockmaster flagged for graft, who truly was guilty, received an exoneration bearing a Lord Admiral's sigil. A loyal engine seer was denounced in a properly keyed servo-skull bulletin for imaginary innovation heresies. The result wasn't mass purge, it was hesitation. Decisions slowed, doubt bloomed, the machine's pulse weakened. Only once these infections circulated did Abaddon show the fist. The Second Black Crusade in the strict military sense, recorded later as an incursion repelled, was the visible plume above a subterranean burn. Black Legion strike flotillas hit outlying refit stations in scattered contradictory thrusts. Some they crippled, others they deliberately missed, allowing panicked administrators to overshift load to already stressed yards. Raiding cadres boarded transport hulks, not to slaughter crews, but to swap container registries, rerouting munitions shipments so regiments received the wrong caliber stocks months later on distant war fronts. Through it all, Abaddon remained in motion, never lingering where Imperial counterstrike could pin him, always pushing responses toward the logistical choke points he'd mapped. He did not waste elite veterans storming the primary orbital bastions. Instead, he committed warp-cloaked insertion teams to the deep stack data vault clusters that governed template authorization. They overwrote nothing obvious. They altered checksum hierarchies. From that day forward, 1,000 future macro cannon housings and plasma induction coils rolled off Bellis Corona's lines within tolerance, but misaligned to degrade under battlefield stress. No siren sounded, no report glowed red. The damage would show itself years later, blamed on poor maintenance, hostile environments, localized corruption. By then, the crusade would be history and Abaddon somewhere else. There was one overt blow, and he chose it carefully. In the high-orbit dry docks hung Orbital Array, G-17 Crown Bastion, a symbol installation used in recruitment picked feeds across the sector, a perfect, unblemished hull where decorated captains ceremonially recommissioned vessels. Abaddon translated the vengeful spirit into real space inside the array's exclusion perimeter, a maneuver thought impossible under Imperial Auspex net density. It was not impossible. Zarafistan had mapped phase harmonics in the system's overlapping void shields months earlier. The Warmaster walked Array G-17 under siren and gunfire, cut its master shrine in half with Drachnien, and transmitted a single open-channel vox burst to every listening platform. Bellis Corona will still build ships. They will carry your banners. They will fail you. Then he left. Imperial records list the engagement as limited. Enemy forces withdrew. Sector Command declared the system secured after minor incursion. Fabricator general audits followed. Dozens of tech adepts were censured. Repairs were enacted. Ceremonies resumed. From the outside, Bellis Corona endured. That is exactly what Abaddon intended. A destroyed yard can be rebuilt under emergency decree. A compromised one continues supplying failure into every war zone it touches. The true harvest came later. Frigates translated fatally off course. Escorts arrived to campaigns with incompatible fuel load couplings. Cruiser squadrons suffered synchronized plasma conduit ruptures at the 3rd month mark in prolonged void sieges. Admirals blamed manufactorum corners cut, local corruption, even Xenos sabotage. Very few traced the pattern back to Bellis Corona because the pattern never pointed in a straight line. That was Abaddon's art: distributed injury, delayed detonation. What did he learn? That the Imperium's strength is momentum. Interrupt the rhythm and whole crusades shatter. After Bellis Corona, Abaddon began building frameworks into every major operation. Always strike upstream. Always leave poison in the pipes. From this campaign grew the doctrines that would later guide his preparations for the 13th Crusade. Identify the infrastructures the Imperium cannot imagine losing, and ensure that when the decisive blow lands, those systems are already hollow. Belis Corona also hardened how he judged subordinates. Several Black Legion captains argued for a full-scale kill strike once the system reeled. "Burn it and let the sector choke," one said. Abaddon refused. "Destruction is noisy. Corrosion breeds despair." He executed 2 captains for insubordination after they prematurely slagged a secondary yard he meant to spare. Their skulls were welded to a data rack in the Vengeful Spirit's strategium with the inscription, "Obedience is endurance." The lesson spread. Serving Abaddon meant learning to fight wars that outlived you. Zaraphiston's auguries, cast in the aftermath, recorded a curious echo. The machine spirits of 3 Belis Corona production lines continued to chant reversed benedictions generations after purge rites were performed. Even under Mechanicus reconsecration, the code did not wholly clear. Abaddon considered that a success metric. Imperium systems could be haunted, not by demons alone, but by engineered doubt. When stories of the cursing of Corona circulated in clandestine inquisitorial briefs centuries later, they were redacted, buried, then quietly reissued under stricter seal. Too destabilizing for wide doctrinal dissemination, too important to ignore. Naval officers with access to the sealed files developed a superstition: never trust a hull-stamped Corona mark without triple right. Some refused the hulls altogether. Through suspicion alone, Abaddon had slowed Imperial fleet throughput far beyond any tonnage he destroyed. That is why Belis Corona matters in Abaddon's legend. Not because of the bodies, not even because of the ships, but because it was the first time the Imperium truly feared its own reliability. He had shown that victory against him was never final and safety never certain. Every invoice, every machine prayer, every maintenance log could hide his hand. From that day, Imperial Command began asking a question it had not asked since the heresy. What if the failure was placed there? Abaddon's answer was already in motion, spiraling outward from Belis Corona into every campaign he would wage thereafter. Decay was a weapon. Systems rot faster than flesh. Empires fall from within, and he would be there to push when they leaned too hard on walls they no longer knew were crumbling. Abaddon had never declared war on the Imperial Creed. He didn't need to. Where others burned churches to be feared or tore down cathedrals in acts of theatrical heresy, Abaddon understood that true sacrilege was not in flames, but in desecration. He didn't want the faithful to die shouting their hymns. He wanted them to stop singing, to see their saints unmade, to look at the altar and wonder if the Emperor had ever truly listened. And so he chose Euphrate IV, the shrine world of Saint Gerstal. The world was not strategically vital. It had no forges, no major naval yards, no caches of ancient technology, but it had pilgrims. Thousands every week, hundreds of thousands every year. A planet built around the idea that faith alone could sustain a world's worth. Its economy was sacral, its defense forces were ceremonial, its skies were filled with incense, not gunships. Abaddon had no intention of conquering it. He intended to expose it. He gave no orders to his fleet. No grand Black Crusade, no armadas at the system's edge. What came instead were whispers, encoded messages sent through hijacked ecclesiarchy networks, stammered visions infecting the dreams of astropaths, false saints manifesting in warp echoes. The world began to shudder without a single enemy vessel in sight. Then the signs began. Statues of Saint Gerstal, always shown with her back arched in holy martyrdom, a blade through her breast as she died proclaiming the Emperor's glory, began to crack. Every single one, from the marble colossus at the Gate of Martyrs to the gold-veined figurines on domestic altars, developed a fracture across the torso. No one could explain it. No earthquakes, no sabotage, just a fissure. Identical. Always the same angle. Priests called for purification rites. Pilgrims began to question, softly at first. A test of faith, some said. A punishment, others whispered. When the sermons began to shake, the administrators turned to logic. Perhaps a resonance fault in the planet's substrata. Perhaps an astropathic feedback ripple. The more they explained, the more uncertain they became. Then came the day of black rain. It was not meteorological. No weather system birthed it. On the morning of the Martyr's Rise, St. Gerstall's feast day, the skies wept ink. Oily, viscous droplets fell in silence. Rain that burned nothing, poisoned no one, but soaked vestments, banners, and faces. Streaks of black bled down murals, rendering saints eyeless. Gold leaf icons shimmered in the tainted deluge, then corroded, not with acid, but with shame. The next day, the first pilgrim threw herself into the well of benediction. Not in ecstasy, but in despair. By the time the vengeful spirit translated into system, the world had already begun to unravel. Ecclesiastical officials wept openly in processions. Some accused one another of secret heresies. Masses faltered. The liturgies no longer resonated in the vox altars. St. Gerstall's name, once spoken with reverence, began to curdle on the tongue. Only then did Abaddon strike, not with the full fury of the Black Legion, but with a single spear. The Xerxes anathema, a warband drawn from the word-bearers and bent to his will, led by the corrupted former canoness Triana Morn, made planetfall not at the Capitol's spire, but at the shrine mausoleum deep in the southern crypt ranges where Gerstall's bones were kept. They brought no tanks, no siege equipment. They didn't need them. The planetary defenses, unprepared for a surgical small-scale strike, reacted too slowly. By the time the PDF mobilized, the Xerxes anathema had already broken into the reliquary. They broadcast their desecration live. Every screen, every pict feed, every shrine-linked pulpit in the city of Solace and beyond blazed with a single image. Triana Morn, clad in defiled power armor, standing above the shattered sarcophagus of St. Gerstall, and in her hand the skull of the saint, crown of thorns still fused to the bone, slowly crushed between her gauntlets. No sermon, no rant, just the sound of holy bone cracking. The ecclesiarchy screamed. The Adepta Sororitas began a planet-wide mobilization. The few Imperial Navy vessels in orbit descended into Atmo to begin bombardment protocols. But Abaddon was already gone. His strike wasn't designed to hold ground. It wasn't meant to draw battle. It was designed to shatter certainty. Within days, pilgrims stopped coming. Within weeks, the local clergy tore itself apart in theological schism. A dozen new heresies bloomed, each claiming to have rediscovered the true meaning of Gerstall's martyrdom. 3 cardinal priests excommunicated one another within a single broadcast. Worse still, the world's own astropaths began to lose cohesion. The psychic trauma, the exposure to warp-born contradiction, the sudden and violent shattering of a saint's myth. These things tore at the thin membranes of faith that shielded their minds. Some screamed in high Gothic until they bled from the eyes. Some simply walked out into the black rain and never returned. And then came the true insult. A year after the desecration, when the ecclesiarchy finally re-entombed what they could recover of the saints' remains, bone splinters, bits of rib, fragments of skull, something began to grow from the stone where her reliquary had once stood. A flower, black, iridescent, organic, yet not of any species recognized by the Mechanicus. No attempts to destroy it worked. It regrew, each time faster. The priests eventually sealed the chamber, but the pilgrims who still came Those few who had not lost hope began to whisper that the flower was Gerstal, that her death was incomplete, that her sanctity had been stolen. Abaddon, for his part, never mentioned the desecration in any of his war logs. It was not a battle to him. It was instruction. He understood what even the Chaos Gods often forgot. Faith is not extinguished by violence. It is eroded by disillusionment, by making Euphrates the Fourth weep, by breaking not the faithful but their foundations. Abaddon did more than destroy a shrine. He taught the Imperium that their saints could bleed, that their faith could fracture, that even belief could be hollowed out with enough pressure. And the effects spread far beyond the system. Other shrine worlds began reinforcing their reliquaries, doubling their psychic wards, fortifying what had never been fortified before. Why? Because they were afraid, not of another army, but of meaning being taken from them. That was the true cost of the Saint Gerstal desecration. It forced the ecclesiarchy to fight a war it could not see, against ideas, against implications, against the whisper in the dark that said, "What if they're all lies?" Abaddon had no need to desecrate every shrine in the Imperium. He only needed to desecrate one, and let the rest wonder if they were next. From this point forward, every world he approached with a known saintly site entered immediate lockdown. Civilian traffic halted, religious ceremonies ceased, entire pilgrimage routes were severed. In their attempt to preserve the image of sanctity, the ecclesiarchy did Abaddon's work for him. They cut their people off from their own faith. Paranoia replaced piety. Abaddon had planted a seed, and it was growing. Even inquisitorial agents, those trained to dissect heresy with logic and fire, began noting changes, not just in the people, but in the warp. Pilgrimage routes once lit with psychic resonance grew dimmer. Astropathic messages sent near former shrine worlds grew harder to decipher. Something fundamental was shifting. It was as if the warp itself had begun to doubt. The Chaos Gods watched with something between delight and confusion, for they too fed on faith. But Abaddon did not feed. He carved. He reshaped the warp, not through devotion, but through sheer will. In Saint Gerstal's broken skull, he had etched a lesson into the fabric of the galaxy. That belief is not eternal, that sanctity can be murdered, and that even the most sacred blood, when spilled, rots like any other. That is why they call him the Butcher of Faith, not because he slew a saint, but because he made the Imperium stop believing. There are worlds that fall with screams, worlds that shatter in hours, hive cities consumed by virus bombs, forge worlds razed by orbital bombardment, death worlds that die as they were born, in fire and madness. But Elfanor was not such a world. Elfanor was meant to endure. It was the fortress world, the bulwark, the exemplar of imperial tenacity, a bastion fortified during the Great Crusade and retrofitted across millennia. It was declared by the Segmentum Command as unbreachable by conventional force. It was where failed governors were sent to relearn humility, and where new crusades were launched to recover lost worlds in the Cadian sector. To most of the Imperium, Elfanor was unconquerable, so Abaddon made it a priority. Not for resources, not for revenge, for message. The galaxy needed to know that nothing was sacred, and no defense was permanent. And Abaddon needed to prove, not to others, but to himself, that he could bring low any symbol of imperial strength, regardless of how long it had stood. But he did not begin with siege lines. He began with names. Over decades, Abaddon had cultivated dozens of sleeper agents, disguised not as soldiers or saboteurs, but as humble functionaries. A customs administrator here, a senior munitorum quartermaster there, a shrine cantor whose sermons grew subtly less aligned with doctrine over the years. These were not tools of direct destruction. They were instruments of misdirection, The plan was simple in theory. Let Elfanor think it had time. That was the first fracture. The Black Legion's fleet arrived not with a thunderous translation, but as a drizzle. Raider groups, recon wings, escort flotillas arriving in irregular intervals, never enough to cause panic, always just below the threshold of a full mobilization. The High Command of Elfanor watched, calculated, then dismissed the threat. That was the second fracture. Abaddon used their complacency as a battering ram. Within a week, 3 orbital defense satellites mysteriously failed to respond to Central Command protocols. When the Mechanicus dispatched tech priests to investigate, they vanished. Vox ghosts reported laughter in binary. A week later, the satellites came back online, broadcasting a litany of coordinates encoded with inverted Imperial hymns. The Psychers began to scream. Abaddon's fleet moved inward, not fast, not yet. He allowed the defenders to maneuver, to deploy assets. Let them think they could control the space. Because he wanted their ships in orbit, anchored, predictable. That was when he loosed the Unseen Host, a warband so deeply embedded with warp shadow cloaks and phase-shifting rituals that even Auspex couldn't track their atmospheric descent. They fell upon the subcontinental generatorum complexes, the nervous system of Elfanor's defense grid. They didn't destroy them. They reversed them. Across Elfanor's central continent, defense turrets began to fire not outward but inward, gunning down watchtowers, sensor arrays, even their own void shield nodes. It was sabotage engineered to look like madness, command bunkers overloaded trying to process conflicting reports. Then the real invasion began. Abaddon descended aboard the Vengeful Spirit, his Terminator elites carving a path through orbital debris fields, even as the planet's void shield flickered and pulsed with warp static. What followed was not a battle. It was a demonstration. The defenders expected a siege. They got a surgical exorcism. Every key location, military command, ecclesiarchal archives, orbital control, was hit in sequence, not simultaneously. Abaddon wanted each to fall in view of the next. He let them watch. Let them understand that resistance was not enough. He led the assault on the bastion of the Tetrarchs personally. A fortress monastery embedded in the Ironheart Mountains, it was home to the 322nd Elfanor Steel Guard, veterans of 3 crusades, personally blessed by the High Lords. Its walls had not been breached in 8,000 years. Abaddon breached them in under 6 hours. The Steel Guard met him in the Plaza of Banners, an open-air kill box surrounded by statues of Imperial heroes, each one taller than a Titan. Abaddon walked through the gunfire, Drachnian hissing with unreality, the talon of Horus already soaked in blood. The Steel Guard fought like lions. They died screaming. Not because they were weak, but because nothing can stand against inevitability. By the time the final bastion fell, Abaddon stood amidst burning marble and shattered icons. He ordered a single-picked capture to be transmitted through all known Imperial channels. Himself, standing atop the ruined statue of Lord Castellan Dirax, one boot on the old hero's cracked face. And then silence. He didn't proclaim victory. He didn't broadcast demands. Because Elfanor was not the point. The idea of Elfanor was the point, and now it was gone. The effects were immediate. Planetary governors across the Cadian sector began panicking. Defense audits tripled. Resources were diverted from frontline conflicts to reinforce non-strategic assets. Astra Militarum deployments stalled, waiting for reinforcements that never came. The Imperium breathed differently after Elfanor, because it had learned something it refused to believe for 10,000 years. No world is safe. And that wasn't all. In the wreckage of the Basilica Exalt, the oldest cathedral on Elfanor, Abaddon left a single artifact, an iron spike hammered into the cracked altar around which the stone itself had begun to bleed. It was not demonic, it was symbolic, a message that what had once stood for eternity could be brought low, that the so-called unbreakable could be shattered, not with fire or fury, but with certainty. Elfenor had not simply fallen, it had submitted, because even its defenders had begun to understand this was not just war, this was correction. Abaddon did not garrison the world, he did not enslave it. After a month, he left, taking only war spoils and captured tacticians, whom he later executed as part of a symbolic offering to his own memory of Horus. Not to honor the dead Warmaster, but to exorcise him. For Abaddon saw in Elfenor not just a triumph over the Imperium, but over the ghost of his own past. The boy who had once called Horus father was gone. This was not the son of a fallen Warmaster. This was the Warmaster fulfilled, and Elfenor would remain a scar upon the galaxy's belief in stability. The High Lords tried to spin the loss. They called it temporary. They rebranded the world a minor bastion, unworthy of full-scale retaliation. But those who knew, the Inquisitors, the Lord Commanders, the Chapter Masters, spoke in quiet voices about the lesson of Elfenor, that Abaddon had learned not just how to destroy, but how to unmake, how to reach into the bones of a civilization and snap them, and in that he had become something Horus never was, not a usurper, but a reaper, an architect of endings, and his crusade would no longer be measured in casualties, or sectors lost, or shrines defiled. It would be measured in certainties killed. Elfenor was the first. It would not be the last. The Eye of Terror is not a place. It is a hunger, a wound in the galaxy where the laws of nature are drowned beneath raw emotion and fractured time. Within its depths, stars scream, gods whisper, and mortals are broken or remade. It is the crucible of chaos, where no journey ends as it begins. And at its black heart, Abaddon the Despoiler built his empire, not with stone or steel, but with oaths, blood-soaked bargains, and the kind of ruthlessness that even the gods paused to watch. After the fall of Elfenor, the Black Legion swelled. Victories had brought Abaddon more than territory. They brought him offerings. Warbands sought to kneel at his feet, plying him with demon engines, enslaved psychers, and relics torn from forgotten temples. Demon princes offered fealty, hoping to siphon a share of his rising legend. Others challenged him, hoping to carve glory from his defeat. All were given the same choice: bend or bleed. But no matter how large his war host became, Abaddon knew a truth most warlords refused to acknowledge. Power in the eye was unstable. Demonic patrons were fickle, rival lords treacherous, and alliances decayed faster than corpses under warp reign. The legions had splintered long ago, and chaos had no throne of its own. To truly wield dominion, Abaddon needed more than legions. He needed guarantees. And guarantees in the Eye of Terror are bought with blood. It was in the aftermath of his fifth Black Crusade, a feint designed to draw the gaze of Imperial reinforcements while his allies scoured ancient vaults in the Segmentum Obscurus, that Abaddon returned to the Eye. Not to rest, but to bargain. Not with mortals, with gods. The gods of chaos, capricious and inhuman, do not grant power freely. They demand sacrifices, not just of life, but of meaning, identity, destiny. And so Abaddon entered the twisted realm of the demon world of Urim-Kar, where the rivers flowed with fire, and time coiled around itself like a serpent devouring its tail. He came alone. His lieutenants begged to accompany him. He denied them all, because what he was about to do, no one could witness and survive unchanged. Urim-Kar was a place where champions came to offer their souls for demonic ascension. Many never left. Others returned monstrous, hollowed out by their bargains. Abaddon sought neither fate. He was not there to become a demon. He was there to command them. At the gate of sorrow, where the sky bled light and the wind moaned in Imperial Gothic, Abaddon carved his name into the petrified bones of a fallen primarch's clone, an unnamed experiment left abandoned by Fabius Bile. This act, symbolic defiance of flawed resurrection, served as his calling card to the gods, a statement that he did not crawl for approval. He summoned them, and they came. Khorne, the Lord of Rage, appeared as a mountain of armored hatred, his voice a thunderclap of contempt. Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, unfurled as a kaleidoscope of eyes and mouths, speaking in riddles that contradicted themselves. Nurgle laughed warmly, his filth-choked glee drowning the air in rot, and Slaanesh shimmered into being as a chorus of desire and horror, each word a temptation, each breath a dagger. Most mortals who stood in their presence burned, screamed, or collapsed. Abaddon remained still. He offered no worship, no submission. Instead, he offered a deal. He would continue the long war. He would sow despair across the stars. He would unmake the Imperium, not in the name of chaos, but in the name of truth. He would tear down the Emperor's lie and feed the galaxy to the storm. In return, he asked for binding, not boons, not ascension, obligations. Each god would give him a champion, a chosen servant gifted with their power, but sworn to his will. Not free agents, not wild demons, weapons. The gods laughed, they cursed, they mocked, but they listened. Because Abaddon was not a supplicant, he was a fulcrum, a point through which the wars of mortals and immortals alike could be tipped. And so, one by one, the gods agreed. From the forges of the brass citadel, Khorne gave him Uzulmet the Flayer, a demon champion who had once slain 10,000 Imperial fists alone during the heresy. Now leashed with a chain forged from his own spinal cord, he roared only when Abaddon allowed it. Tzeentch sent him Threxos the Mirror-born, a sorcerer whose voice drove men mad and whose prophecies unmade entire campaigns. He served not as Abaddon's prophet, but as his mirror, allowed to see but never speak unless spoken to. Nurgle gifted the Helgamar twins, two grotesque psyker beasts whose conjoined minds broadcast psychic despair like a beacon. They did not fight in open battle. They walked through cities, and those who felt them coming often died by suicide before the first shot was fired. And Slaanesh sent Velkrix, a demon in the form of a flawless, genderless creature clad in golden chains, whose song could rewrite memory. Abaddon used them to erase loyalty in others, not to seduce but to unmake. These were not allies. They were tools, bound by rights only Abaddon understood, oaths etched into their very essence. Should any act without his order, their pact would rupture and cast them back into the warp screaming. But even that was not enough. Abaddon sought power of a different kind. He journeyed to the Cradle of Sinew, a fortress of bone and shadow drifting at the edge of the eye, where the last surviving schemata of the Word-bearer's warp conjuration rituals were entombed. There, amid ruins built of blasphemy, he carved the Obsidian Concord, a covenant not with demons or lords, but with rules themselves. He wove into the fabric of his fleet's warp signature a pattern that marked it as inviolable. No demonic entity could consume a Black Legion vessel without Abaddon's silent consent. The ritual bled 12,000 slaves dry, but from that day forward, the Eye recognized Abaddon's ships as his domain, not the gods. It was a message even the demon princes heard. The Black Legion did not belong to Chaos. Chaos belonged to Abaddon. He did not seek to become a god. He sought to become the fulcrum upon which gods turned. And so the Eye changed. Where once it had been a place of fractal ambition and betrayal, now it bent subtly around the Warmaster's will. Rival warlords began to mimic his structure, enforce discipline. Demon worlds began to tithe troops, not to chaos undivided, but to him. The old guard resisted. Many died. Abaddon's message was simple: I do not ask. I command. The warbands that refused were not conquered in battle. They were undermined, their rituals corrupted, their demons unbound. Within weeks, whole fleets disappeared into warp storms conjured by Abaddon's new psychic lords. Others found themselves cursed by prophecy, fated to fail, and in the eye, fate has power. In less than 2 decades, Abaddon had done what no traitor since the heresy had achieved. He had centralized chaos without worshipping it. And in this crucible of blood and will, the Black Legion became more than a legion. It became a template, a model, a doctrine, one god, one vision, one war. His war. He did not become a demon prince. He refused. For Abaddon knew demon princes were bound, chained to the whim of their patron, their forms grotesque, their power immense, but their freedom an illusion. Abaddon chose instead to remain mortal, because mortality in the eye is the greatest rebellion. It is choice, and with that choice Abaddon took what the gods could not give him: control. Control of his legion, control of his destiny, control of the very warp. And so, when he emerged from the eye once more, his war host swelling, his packs forged, his empire bound in blood and ritual, he did not roar or chant or pray. He simply raised the talon of Horus, looked across the stars, and spoke 2 words: begin again. Because war to Abaddon was never about rage, it was about ownership. And now he didn't just own a legion. He owned chaos itself. Command in the Eye of Terror is not maintained through bureaucracy. It is not won by democratic consensus, nor held by administrative decree. It is written in the black blood of betrayal, the raw howls of demagogues, and the silence of those who vanish mid-sentence. And in such a realm, Abaddon the Despoiler stands alone, not because he craves solitude, but because no one else could survive it. By the time of the 7th Black Crusade, Abaddon had forged the Black Legion into the most feared force in the Eye. He had burned saints from their altars, sundered fortress worlds, and carved pacts into the bones of demons. But these victories came at a cost, not merely in blood or bodies, but in loyalty. For every warlord beneath him bore their own ambitions, and in chaos, ambition festers like rot. Even as Abaddon struck outward, the greatest threats to his rule were often behind him. Not the Imperium, not the Eldar, not the Orcs or the Necrons, but his own lieutenants. Many among them had once been lords in their own right, veterans of the heresy, former captains of the Sons of Horus, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and even the Word-Bearers. They had bled for the Long War. But some believed Abaddon was simply another claimant to a title no one could ever truly hold, and so they tested him. The most infamous of these was Varkan the Flayed, a former company commander from the Sons of Horus, who claimed direct descent from the Warmaster's favored inner circle. Varkan was bold, charismatic, and dangerously persuasive. He commanded 6 warbands and had begun quietly referring to himself as the Horus Reborn. His banners bore not the eye of Horus, but the Warmaster's face, flayed from statues and pressed into leather. To many it was madness, to others it was legacy. Abaddon did not denounce Varkan. He invited him. The gathering aboard the Vengeful Spirit was staged in the Inner Strategium, a chamber once walked by Horus himself. Abaddon sat at its heart, not upon a throne, but standing at a hololithic map of the Segmentum Solar. Varkan entered, surrounded by his chosen, each one a killer, each one bearing gifts of blood, relics, and oaths. Abaddon did not flinch. He listened. He allowed Varkan to speak of brotherhood, of Horus, of the destiny they all shared. And when he finished, Abaddon spoke only one phrase: "I am not Horus." Then he unleashed Draknyen. The demon blade howled, not with hunger, but with recognition. It remembered Varkan's kind. It had tasted them before, and it wanted more. The battle that followed was not one-sided. Varkan's chosen were elite, twisted by the eye, imbued with blessings. But Abaddon moved through them like inevitability given form. Bolter shells screamed past him. Power weapons crackled. One struck his shoulder, another his side. He ignored them. He fought not as a warrior, but as a symbol. Varkan died screaming, not from a wound, but from the breaking of his pact. For Abaddon had carved a secret brand into the warp itself, marking Varkan as his. And when Draknyen pierced his chest, it did not drink just his soul, but his story. Every lie, every claim, every whisper of rebellion was devoured. When it was over, Abaddon stood over the corpse of his would-be rival, turned to the remaining warlords and said, "I do not lead because I was chosen. I lead because I endure." That message spread. But rebellions did not end, because in the eye of terror, challenge is not betrayal, it is expected. Abaddon understood this. He allowed it, at times, because to forbid ambition in chaos is to deny its nature. But he ensured every challenge was answered. There was Kordakal of the Gilded Pain, a Slaneshi warlord who attempted to form a breakaway legion during the 8th Black Crusade. His forces vanished in a warp rift, their banners later found nailed to the hull of a Black Legion cruiser, each one defaced with a single phrase: "Desire is weakness." There was Grendel the Weeper, a Nurgle-aligned psyker who poisoned the minds of Black Legion sergeants with visions of doom and decay. Abaddon confronted him personally, not with a blade, but with a mirror, an artifact taken from Velkrix, showing Grendel his own rotted future. The psyker collapsed into madness and was cast into the eye screaming. But the most dangerous rebellion came not from a warlord, but from within the Legion itself. Thalkaran the Hollow, first claw captain of the 5th cohort, had served Abaddon faithfully for centuries. He was known for his precision, his cold logic, his loyalty. Until he wasn't. Thalkaran's betrayal came not through battle, but influence. He began rerouting reinforcements, subtly delaying Abaddon's orders, questioning tactics not openly but through implication. He grew a following, not of zealots, but of administrators, the logistical blood of the Legion. Supply officers, fleet coordinators, navigators. He didn't want to dethrone Abaddon. He wanted to replace him quietly. A slow coup draped in bureaucracy. Abaddon responded by vanishing. For 6 weeks, no word came from the Warmaster. The Legion grew tense. Thalkaran moved faster, preparing his command fleet, drawing plans, reassigning captains. Then the vengeful spirit re-emerged. But it was different. It came not through warp translation, but from the eye itself, emerging in a tear of screaming light above Thalkaran's fleet. Abaddon had not been hiding. He had been communing, not with the gods, but with the Blackstone. The ancient technologies he had stolen during earlier campaigns had yielded secrets. He used them now. One by one, Thalkaran's ships ceased to exist, not exploded, not torn apart, just erased. Cut from the material realm by gravitational rupture. Not even demons remained. Abaddon did not issue a declaration. He appeared aboard Thalkaran's flagship alone. And in front of his would-be usurper, he did something none expected. He forgave him. Then he slit his throat and fed his soul to the eye. Because leadership is not cruelty, it is clarity. Abaddon understood what so many others never could, that to lead in chaos, one must balance the fury and the function. He was the avatar of war, yes, but also its discipline. He could inspire, he could command, he could terrify, but more than anything, he could manage. He turned rebellion into ritual, challenge into proof, failure into warning. Each internal war made the Black Legion stronger, not by purging weakness, but by refining ambition. Every lieutenant who survived became sharper, more dangerous, more loyal, not from fear, but from understanding that serving Abaddon was not submission. It was direction. In a galaxy of madness where gods changed their minds mid-prayer and demons whispered conflicting truths, Abaddon offered consistency. And in doing so, he did something Horus never could. He made his legion whole, not just bound by past oaths or old pride, but by purpose. Because while others saw chaos as freedom, Abaddon saw it as potential, something that must be wielded, not drowned in. And for that, he paid in blood, his and everyone else's. But that is the price of leadership, not being followed, but being feared, obeyed, and remembered. And in the eye of terror, there is no one more remembered than the one who never had to scream to be heard. To most, Abaddon is a hammer, a force of raw destruction, a conqueror crowned in fire and blood, wielding a demon's sword that devours souls, and a war host vast enough to darken systems. And while it is true that his name is etched in every shattered citadel and burning shrine across the segmentum obscurus, this truth is only half the story. The other half hides behind whispers, half-spoken commands, lies that became prophecies, confessions that were never true, yet still destroyed whole worlds. For Abaddon is not just a warmaster, he is a chess master, and his most powerful weapon has never been the talon of Horus, nor the demon blade Drachnyen, but the ability to make others move for him. The Imperium, in its arrogance, believes chaos is blunt, that diamonds scream and charges roar and corruption is always loud. But Abaddon understood something deeper, something few in the eye of terror ever grasped. Deception is a weapon. And in the age of Imperium, where trust is currency and suspicion a survival instinct, misdirection can achieve what 1,000 bolters cannot. This understanding led to the birth of the Oathless Cabal, not a warband, not a cult, a network. Born in the shadow of his campaigns, seeded during his so-called failed crusades, the Oathless Cabal operated as Abaddon's invisible hand. Each member was a liar by trade, rogue inquisitors, traitor scribes, corrupted astropaths, or even long-lost sons of noble houses turned heretics in secret. They had no uniforms, no banners. They did not gather. They infiltrated. And their instructions were simple: undermine belief, not just in the Emperor, but in certainty. One Cabal cell embedded itself on Carthax Prime, a shrine world untouched by war, but smothered in faith. They did not kill its clergy. They simply edited the scripture. Over time, doctrines began to contradict. Rituals lost their cohesion, and high-ranking preachers unknowingly proclaimed heresies disguised as forgotten hymns. When the Inquisition arrived, they burned the entire ecclesiarchy. Not one shot was fired by chaos. Another cell whispered across the Navis Nobilitae, spreading rumors of false routes, phantom warp beacons, and psychic anomalies. The result: entire battle fleets delayed for months, forced to reroute through hostile territory or collide with warp storms that, in truth, did not exist. These were not acts of violence. They were acts of control. Even as planets fortified against a coming storm, they realized too late the storm was already inside. And this subtlety was not limited to human worlds. Abaddon turned his mask toward aliens too. During the 11th Black Crusade, the Imperium clashed not only with chaos, but with a rising Orc empire in the Maelstrom's edge. Rather than confront both, Abaddon arranged for the Orcs to find relics planted by his own warbands, suggesting the Emperor was a lying god who had once enslaved the Green Tide. Fueled by rage, the Orcs turned their crusade toward Holy Terra's outer defenses, delaying Imperial reinforcements that might have crippled Abaddon's real target in the Daranath Belt. No battles were fought between Chaos and Orcs, yet Chaos won, because they never needed to be there. Even the Eldar, masters of manipulation, fell victim to his games. The craft world Idare, long guided by cryptic prophecy, detected signs of Abaddon's movement near the Cadian Gate. Seers scrambled to intervene, deploying an elite strike force to intercept a Black Legion vanguard near the Maelstrom. The battle cost them dearly, but they emerged victorious. Or so they believed. In truth, the Black Legion ships were drones, crafted from stolen Mechanicus schemata, piloted by enslaved servitors rigged to explode upon boarding. The true attack, led by Abaddon himself, was launched against Kaldrak Forge, thousands of light years away. While the Eldar were fighting shadows, their prize forge world burned. Abaddon never gloated, never claimed credit, because for him, victory was not found in being seen. It was found in being misunderstood, and misunderstanding is a battlefield all its own. Abaddon's command structure was laced with decoys and contradictions. No one knew all his plans. Many of his captains thought themselves favored, while others suspected they were being used. Some were, some weren't. The point was that they didn't know, and when your enemies, or even your allies, don't know what you want, they begin to destroy themselves trying to guess. Take the example of Lord Varnak, a rival warlord from the Iron Warriors, who believed Abaddon was preparing to elevate a new demon world in his sector. Varnak launched a preemptive strike to claim it, but the world was a trap. Abaddon had seeded it with buried warp detonators and left it laced with psionic residue from a failed black ship. The result? Varnak's fleet was torn apart, not by battle, but by their own psychosis, awakened by false signals and ambient screams. Abaddon didn't need to lift a finger. He simply let paranoia do the killing. Not even the Inquisition was immune. Abaddon knew that suspicion among them was both strength and weakness. He exploited it masterfully during the build-up to the 12th Black Crusade, sending contradictory signals across multiple sectors, some suggesting a chaos incursion in Segmentum Tempestus, others in the Eastern Fringe. Inquisitors accused each other of misdirection, of heresy, even of being Abaddon's pawns. 3 Ordos clashed in covert purges, leaving key Imperial worlds undefended. The Black Legion swept through them like a scalpel, and always Abaddon remained the ghost at the center. Never quite in reach, always one step ahead. Not because he was omniscient, but because he knew what his enemies believed, and he shaped that belief like a sculptor carving marble. Because in war, what they think you are is often more powerful than what you truly are. And if you can weaponize perception, you can command armies without ever showing your hand. This mastery extended even to the warp. During one campaign, Abaddon sent emissaries into the demon world of Shyrak's Void, requesting alliance with the local demon prince Malcor Vo. The negotiations were elaborate, filled with ritual and slaughter, as expected. But the emissaries were never meant to succeed. They were a cover. While the prince and his court were distracted with pomp, Abaddon deployed a warp-veiled strike team to steal the chrono rune of Ulm-Thar, a relic buried in Shyrax's vaults that could slow time within a defined area. Malcor Vo only realized the theft after the Black Legion had already used the rune to halt time aboard an Imperial dockyard and destroy a battle fleet mid-launch. Abaddon didn't win with strength. He won with misplaced focus. Even among his own followers, stories began to circulate of his multiplicity, how he appeared on two fronts at once, how he spoke in dreams before a battle began, how he seemed to know what his enemies feared before they even acted. Was it sorcery? Was it prophecy? Number it was preparation, manipulation, misdirection executed so flawlessly that it felt supernatural. Because Abaddon understood what few in chaos ever did, force alone is predictable. And what is predictable is vulnerable. But lies are endless, and truth, real truth, is always surrounded by silence. In this, Abaddon was more than a warlord. He was a phantom. A mask worn over 1,000 faces, each crafted to fracture trust, to pull the Imperium's grip from its own sword hilt, to make certainty a myth and clarity a corpse. So when the High Lord spoke of him as a brute, a madman, a failure of Horus's shadow, they did so because that's what he wanted them to say. Because if they feared his firepower, they would build walls, but if they underestimated his mind, they would leave the doors unlocked. And Abaddon always preferred to walk in unseen. Cadia was more than a fortress, more than a gate, more than the garrisoned ranks and siege-laced skies that defined its war-racked surface. Cadia was belief. For 10,000 years, it stood as the bulwark between the Imperium and the Eye of Terror, a world whose people were born to war and raised in the shadow of chaos. It did not simply guard the Cadian Gate, it was the gate. And as long as Cadia stood, so too did the illusion that the Imperium could endure. Abaddon the Despoiler knew this, and for centuries he waged his black crusades not to break the gate, but to weaken faith in its permanence. He eroded trust, frayed defenses, and drew lines of fracture where others saw only stone. But now, after thousands of years of war, after victories earned in blood and shadows, the Warmaster would strike not with deception, but with finality. The 13th Black Crusade would be his masterpiece. This time there would be no feint, no whispered misdirection. This time Abaddon brought the full fury of his war host to bear, and he would not be denied. His fleet, a nightmare constellation of demon ships, warp-scarred relics, and ancient vessels stolen from the Imperium during the heresy, boiled from the Eye of Terror in numbers not seen since the Great Scouring. The vengeful spirit led the charge, its hull crusted with the bones of dead saints and traitor gold runes burning with warp fire. Cadia's defenders were ready. They had to be. The planet had faced Black Crusades before. Entire generations of Cadians knew nothing but war. The planet's orbital defenses were immense. Defense platforms, void mines, station fortresses, and the great phalanx itself, home of the Imperial Fists, hovered near Cadia to provide support. But Abaddon had not come for a siege. He had come to erase a symbol. He began with the stars themselves. Through ancient sorcery, demon tech, and knowledge bought in soul coin, Abaddon had aligned the warp itself with his plan. Portals opened, real space tore. Demon worlds bled into reality, and warbands poured through the ruptures. This was not simply an invasion, it was inundation. A galaxy's worth of hatred focused on a single world. The Cadian system reeled, but the true blow came not from his fleet. It came from the Blackstone Fortress, one of the few remaining ancient weapons of galactic annihilation. The Blackstone Fortress had long been a source of mystery, its power understood only in fragments. But Abaddon had mastered it. Recovered, corrupted, and reforged, the ancient relic now served as his doomsday weapon. When the Blackstone Fortress opened its weapon arrays and unleashed its fury upon Cadia's orbital defenses, space itself convulsed. Void stations exploded without sound. The phalanx was forced to retreat under the concentrated assault, and the Cadian High Command realized in one brutal moment that they were facing not a raid, not a symbolic strike, but extermination. Still, they held. The Imperial Guard, led by Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed, stood firm. Under his command, defensive perimeters were re-established, orbital debris reconfigured into makeshift shields, and counter-offensives launched with precision. Every inch of Cadia's surface was turned into a death trap. Abaddon responded in kind. He loosed his greatest champions, the Bringers of Despair, his Terminator elite, fell upon defense bastions like thunder. Karn the Betrayer carved through the trenches like a god of war unbound. Typhus, Lucius, Fabius Bile, and even Ahriman of the Thousand Suns all appeared, serving not as equals, but as unleashed instruments of ruin. Each had their own reasons, each brought death by the thousand. The warp itself roiled over Cadia's skies. Blood rains fell from bruised clouds. Madness whispered in Vox channels. Nightmares began before the soldiers fell asleep. But Cadia still stood. Creed held his line. The Cadians, with bolters shaking in calloused hands, fought on. It was not pride that kept them alive. It was purpose, because they knew that Cadia did not fall unless they did. Abaddon understood this, so he shifted focus. He turned the Blackstone Fortress toward Cadia itself. The weapon charged, the storm around it boiled. But before it could fire, the Sky Shield array, salvaged by the Astra Militarum from a downed orbital station, redirected the energy, deflecting the blow into Cadia's crust. It saved the world, for a moment, because the damage was already done. The planetary core cracked, tectonic plates groaned, volcanoes erupted in unnatural synchrony. Cities fell into the sea. A chain reaction began, slow at first, then accelerating. Cadia was dying. Still, they did not surrender. Even as the ground buckled beneath their boots, the Cadians fought on. Abaddon descended personally, spearheading the final assault. Clad in his Baroque Terminator plate, black and gold adorned with trophies of fallen saints, he strode through the firestorms with Drachnien in hand and the talon of Horus bellowing warp-accelerated death. Creed stood at the final bastion, and Abaddon faced him, not as a warrior to a warrior, but as a funeral dirge given form. Their clash was not a duel in the classic sense. Creed could not match the Despoiler in strength, but he fought regardless, not with hope of victory, but with the unshakable belief that Cadia could still mean something. In the end, Creed fell, but he was not broken. Even in death, his final acts ensured the evacuation of thousands of Cadian survivors, his last gambit to deny Abaddon a total annihilation. As Cadia's crust tore open, as the Blackstone Fortress was finally destroyed by an unprecedented counterstrike, a mix of loyalist sabotage, Xenos interference, and sheer desperation, the Warmaster did not mourn the weapon's loss, because the fortress was never his true weapon. Cadia itself had been, and now it was gone. The planet's remains spiraled into chaos. The Cadian Gate, long believed to be the Imperium's wall against the warp, was torn open. The Great Rift split reality, severing the galaxy in two. With the fall of Cadia, the Cicatrix Maledictum was born, and with it, the age of the Dark Imperium. Abaddon did not declare victory. He did not gloat. For him, the silence that followed was louder than any proclamation. He had broken more than a planet. He had broken certainty. The galaxy would never again look at a bastion and believe it unshakable. Faith, once held like a weapon by the Imperium, now quivered in bleeding hands. The warp-flooded sectors once protected by prayer. Astropaths went blind, black ships vanished, the Emperor's light flickered across 1,000,000 worlds, and still the Warmaster marched, not toward rest, not toward peace, but toward what came next. Cadia had fallen, but the war, it had just begun. Long before the fire fell on Cadia, before warp storms split the galaxy in half and demons walked in daylight, before the Imperium even knew it was bleeding, Abaddon the Despoiler was already winning. Victory, to him, was never a single strike. Not a final battle. It was a slow, deliberate suffocation, a war of decades, centuries, millennia. The Imperium always looked for the spear point, the banner, the roar of war at their gates. But Abaddon had long since ceased fighting for just the next planet, or the next crusade. He was playing the longest game. The galaxy, to him, was a board. Its pieces were legions, ideologies, planets, gods, beliefs. And unlike his peers, demon princes who bartered for temporary glory, warlords who burned bright then vanished, Abaddon understood that empires don't fall overnight. They wither, one institution at a time, one truth after another stripped bare until only rot remains. After the failure of Horus, most of the traitor legions splintered. What had once been the mightiest war engine the galaxy had ever seen devolved into fratricide and hedonism. The World Eaters slaughtered themselves, the Emperor's children sank into madness, even the Thousand Sons lost their unity to sorcerous entropy. Abaddon could have risen among them then, in the power vacuum, but he didn't, because it was too soon. The galaxy still remembered the heresy with clarity. The wounds were still fresh. The Imperium, for all its fractures, was on the defensive but not yet vulnerable. Even the gods of chaos had not chosen a new favorite. They watched, and so Abaddon waited. Not passively, never passively. He rebuilt, at first in silence. From the ruins of the sons of Horus, he reforged the Black Legion, not as a chapter of shame, but as a new creed. He cast off the colors of old. No more green and gold of the Warmaster. His warriors were remade in void black, a hue not of mourning, but of reclamation, the blank canvas upon which a new legacy could be written. Then he began seeding chaos across the galaxy, not in open war, but through leverage. He established pacts with pirate dynasties, rogue Mechanicus enclaves, Xenos mercenaries with grudges against the Imperium. He embedded chaos cults in hive cities where administratum oversight had grown lax. He destabilized food shipments. He bribed planetary governors with forbidden truths. He corrupted navigator lines with whisper-born secrets that made their own kind turn on them in suspicion. This wasn't conquest, it was corrosion. And over the centuries, systems that had stood for 10 millennia began to wobble. Imperial commanders started to doubt their neighbors. Segmentum-wide responses became sluggish. Communication errors increased, not because the Imperium was weakening on its own, but because someone was slowly twisting the blade. Abaddon didn't just count on chaos to break the galaxy, he engineered it. Consider his dealings with Fabius Bile. Most would never trust the twisted gene scientist, and Abaddon didn't. But he understood that Fabius held pieces of the old puzzle, cloning technology, gene seed mastery, knowledge from before the heresy. So Abaddon traded protection, artifacts, and in some cases, entire populations. In return, he demanded results. Bile's efforts were scattered and depraved, but among the failures were successes: unnatural warriors, enhanced traitors, hybrids immune to psychic detection. Abaddon took the best of these and folded them into his elite forces, not to dominate, to incorporate. The Despoiler was never rigid. He was adaptable. Each crusade he launched, 12 before Cadia, was branded by the Imperium as a failure, but to Abaddon they were testing grounds. In the first Black Crusade, he reclaimed the Talon of Horus and Draconian. In the third, he tested demon engines in real combat. In the fifth, he gauged Imperial response times. In the eighth, he corrupted entire sectors with viral beliefs. In the 11th, he used Xenos as proxy armies. Every single campaign served a purpose. to gather data, to sow doubt, to learn how to win when the real war finally came. While the Imperium's generals aged and died, while high lords rose and fell in political cannibalism, Abaddon endured. His war council changed hands often, some killed by rivals, others lost in warp storms. But he remained constant, unedging, focused, because he had time, and time, as he knew, was the one thing the Imperium was always running out of. While loyalists clung to relics and repeated the same tired rituals of a dying religion, Abaddon built innovation. His war fleet evolved, combining demon-forged weaponry with salvaged Xenos technology. His soldiers were not merely Chaos Marines, they were experiments in war. Veterans reforged through centuries of psychic augmentation, chemical enhancement, and demonic pact. But perhaps his greatest achievement before Cadia was the manipulation of faith itself. Abaddon understood that victory wasn't about killing bodies, it was about killing meaning. He infiltrated the ecclesiarchy not with blades, but with questions. Cults seated in backwater worlds didn't preach against the Emperor. They redefined him. They turned him into a puppet, a tyrant, a god of stagnation who feared truth. Heresies wrapped in liturgy, psalms that rhymed with revolt. He didn't need to convince entire planets. He only needed one weak bishop, one popular preacher, one doctrine rewritten. Because once belief is fractured, it never heals clean. And yet, the Imperium laughed, even as warp storms worsened, even as crusade after crusade revealed new horrors. Even as whole sectors were lost to unknown phenomena, they continued to call Abaddon a failure, a shadow of Horus, a pretender. But Abaddon knew better. He didn't want to be Horus. He wanted to succeed where Horus failed. Horus struck too early. He trusted the legions to remain loyal. He tried to win in one blow. Abaddon played forever. He wore down every defense, stripped every veil of security, and waited until the galaxy had forgotten how to hope. And then he struck. Cadia was not the climax. It was the first note of the real symphony. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, was no accident. It was the culmination of rituals performed over centuries. Abaddon's war priests carved symbols into dead moons, opened wounds in time, used demon anchors planted millennia ago to trigger the psychic cascade that tore the galaxy in half. He didn't just break Cadia, he broke reality. And as the Imperium flailed, he did not pause. He pressed on, into the darkness, into the heart of the Imperium Nihilus, where no beacon shone and no order remained. Planets without the Astronomicon turned on themselves. Systems died in silence. Refugees fled toward the light, only to be intercepted by his lieutenants. And Abaddon simply watched. Because this was never about conquest, it was about transition, from one age into his. The age of the Despoiler, a galaxy not ruled by hope or law or imperial lies, but by raw will, by those strong enough to endure truth. He had waited, planned, manipulated, and when the moment came, he pounced, not as a warlord of rage, but as a mathematician of doom, with every variable measured, every outcome predicted, every soul lost already counted in advance. The Imperium thought it was dying from external wounds, but Abaddon knew better. It was dying because he had already hollowed it out, so when the final blade fell, it would make no sound, because in the longest game, checkmate had already been declared. He does not sit a throne, he does not recline in demonic opulence, nor drape himself in the trappings of kingship. Abaddon the Despoiler does not need a crown. Because in the vast silence between the screams of dying stars, he is the only voice that echoes back. In the aftermath of Cadia and the birth of the Great Rift, the galaxy convulsed. For the Imperium, it was an age of panic, of fractured governance, of prayers screamed into dead vox lines. Across Segmentum Obscurus and into the Imperium Nihilus, countless worlds were cut off from the Emperor's light, left to face the horrors of the warp alone. But for Abaddon, it was the age he had bled 10,000 years to birth. The Imperium called it madness. They painted it as collapse, but he knew the truth. It was evolution. Abaddon had not just destroyed Cadia. He had broken the very lie that bound the Imperium together, that it was unassailable, eternal, righteous. And now, with the Cicatrix Maledictum stretching across the stars like a gaping wound, Abaddon began to reshape reality, not with armies alone, with ideas. The Imperium, fractured as it was, attempted to rally. Robut Guilliman returned from stasis. The Indomitus Crusade was launched with fanfare and divine fire. New Space Marines, the Primarchs, were released across the stars like a flood of gene-forged vengeance. Abaddon did not panic. He did not retreat, because he had prepared for this too. The Long War was never about striking while the enemy was weak. It was about being ready for whatever came next. And when Guilliman returned, Abaddon recognized him not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Let the Imperium rally, he thought, because now he had proven that rallies could fail. The Black Legion surged across the warp-rifted galaxy like a tide of vengeance given voice. Abaddon's lieutenants, the most loyal and the most feared, led campaigns in his name. Not because they sought his approval, but because his will had become a gravity well. Entire warbands collapsed into his orbit, not by coercion, but because his path was the only one that offered direction in a universe lost to anarchy. And they followed not because of what he promised, but because of what he had already done. In a galaxy full of false gods, shattered primarchs, and demon princes who screamed louder than they acted, Abaddon stood as something rarer than a demigod. He was consistent. He never died, never faded, never wavered. He led from the front, scarred and enduring. The talon of Horus was still mounted on his gauntlet, each finger a memory of betrayal. Drachnian, bound to his will alone, shrieked in delight every time a saint or loyalist dared to stand before him. His war plate, reforged 1,000 times, bore the marks of gods and the dents of heroes. He was no longer a shadow of Horus. He had become something greater, not a son of the past, but a father to the future of chaos. And that future, in his eyes, did not belong to demons alone. It belonged to those who remembered what it meant to break empires. Abaddon began consolidating not just warbands, but narratives. Across the Eye of Terror, he gathered shattered fragments of Legion culture. He reforged aspects of the Word-Bearer's dark scripture, the Night Lord's brutal justice, even the tactical brilliance of the Iron Warriors. He allowed cults to form around victory itself, sects that worshipped not gods, but the act of conquest, with him as its living prophet. He was not trying to become a god. He despised gods. He remembered what had happened to Horus, how the Warmaster had risen only to be consumed by the four powers, his free will burned out like an oil flare. Abaddon would never kneel. And in that refusal, he became something even the gods respected. Not a pawn, not even a champion, but a force. He walked the balance perfectly, blessed by the ruinous powers but never owned. They granted him gifts, but he returned them if they displeased him. He bore mutations only if they served his purpose. He wielded the warp like a weapon, not a religion. In a realm of madness, he was order. A terrifying, absolute kind of order. And while Guilliman preached renewal from terror, Abaddon was already rewriting the laws of war. He launched precise scalpel strikes on warp-cursed forge worlds to steal their black prince. He dismantled Adeptus Mechanicus cult circles and repurposed their knowledge to birth new demon engines. He allowed the Red Corsairs to fracture segments of the Indomitus Crusade, not through overwhelming force, but through attritional warfare that left the Ultramarines' flanks bloodied and weary. But above all, he outlasted. Guilliman had returned, but Abaddon had never left, and in his mind that was the greatest proof of all. 10,000 years of war, 10,000 years of treachery, betrayal, madness, and loss. And yet he still stood. More than that, he led. No other traitor primarch returned to do what he did. No other demon prince dared challenge Guilliman in the open. And none could deny that the galaxy now turned on the axis of his actions. It wasn't terror that decided the fate of sectors. It was the shadow of the vengeful spirit in the skies above them. In system after system, his symbol, the 8-pointed star wrapped in the jaws of the Eye of Horus, was carved into moons, branded onto the flesh of governors, burned into hive walls by warp fire. Entire cults began worshipping the concept of eternal war, not as a tragedy, but as a necessity. And that ultimately was Abaddon's victory. He had redefined what chaos was, no longer a horde of rage-fueled warbands, but a cause, a unified long war effort with a goal beyond simple destruction, a future forged not in apocalypse but in dominion. He was not a conqueror of planets, he was the breaker of cycles. He was what came after the Imperium had no more lies left to feed its citizens. He was what stood tall when gods faltered and thrones cracked, not because he was perfect, but because he was relentless. He had watched demigods burn. He had outlived crusades, holy orders, ecclesiarchs, warmasters, and demon princes. And now, with the galaxy screaming and broken, he was the one constant, not worshipped, not adored, but obeyed. Because in this new age there are no heroes, no saints, no saviors. There is only the eternal war, and at its heart stands Abaddon, Warmaster eternal, not because he was chosen, but because he chose himself.